They didn't fear the girl when she first walked in. They feared what followed behind her shadow. By sundown, the wind had shifted through Dry Creek like it was carrying a warning no one could quite hear, yet the kind of warning that settles in a man's bones before it reaches his mind. She came in on foot, just past noon, boots worn thin from miles of dust, her dress brushed with the color of the land itself, sun-faded brown stitched with patterns no one in town cared to understand. A silver pendant rested at her throat, catching light in quiet flashes as she moved, not bright, not polished, just present, like it had weight beyond metal. The saloon doors creaked as someone inside pushed them open halfway, then stopped when they saw her standing there still as a fence post, eyes steady, not challenging, not afraid, just watching the town the way a person watches a river before stepping in. Folks along the boardwalk slowed their steps, conversations dropped into half-finished sentences. A child was pulled gently but firmly behind his mother's skirt, boots scraped against dry wood somewhere. A chair shifted inside the saloon, but no one stepped out. The girl didn't ask for anything, she didn't speak. She just walked forward, one measured step at a time, until she reached the water trough near the hitching rail. The water shimmered under the afternoon sun, a thin layer of dust floating on top. She knelt, dipped her fingers in slow circles, as if testing something deeper than temperature, then brought her hand to her lips, not drinking, just touching the water, like it was part of a ritual no one here had been taught. A man across the street leaned against a post, arms crossed, jaw tight. Clint Dower, a name people spoke carefully, not out of respect, but out of habit. He'd been in Dry Creek longer than most, longer than the church, longer than the law, depending on who you asked, and he watched her with a kind of interest that didn't belong to curiosity. It belonged to ownership, like he was already deciding what she meant to this place and how it would end. The wind picked up just enough to lift the edge of her hair, revealing a faint line of dust across her cheek, like she'd come through miles that didn't forgive easily. Clint pushed off the post, boots hitting the dirt with purpose, slow steps at first, then steadier as he crossed the street. Nobody stopped him, nobody spoke, they just watched the space between them shrink like something invisible was tightening. Clint reached her just as she stood. The silver pendant caught the light again, one sharp flicker like a signal. He glanced at it once, then back at her face. "You lost," he said, voice low, not kind, not cruel, just certain. She looked at him for a long moment, not answering, not reacting, just seeing him in a way that made something flicker behind his eyes, something quick, something he covered with a smirk. The kind men where when they feel something they don't understand. She tilted her head slightly, the smallest movement. "No," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "I'm exactly where I need to be." Somewhere behind them a screen door slammed, though no one remembered closing it. The wind stilled just as fast as it had risen, and for a moment the whole town seemed to hold its breath. Clint chuckled, once dry as the dirt under his boots. "We'll see about that," he muttered, but his voice didn't carry the same weight as before. He turned, walking past her shoulder, brushing close enough to feel the presence of that pendant without touching it, and for a second his step faltered just a fraction. Then he kept going down the street, disappearing past the livery stable into the long line of sunlit buildings. The girl remained by the trough, still as before, eyes following the empty space he left behind, as if she was listening to something no one else could hear. And by the time the sun dipped low enough to stretch shadows across the road, Clint Dower was gone, and nobody in Dry Creek could say exactly when it happened, only that the wind had gone quiet again, and something unseen had begun to move. By the time the last light slipped behind the ridge, the town of Dry Creek had already begun to change, not in ways a man could point to, not in anything written down or spoken aloud, but in the quiet spaces between things, the kind of change that settles like dust where no one thinks to look. The saloon stayed open later than usual that night, though fewer men drank and more of them watched the door. Sheriff Thomas Hale stood near the far wall, one boot hooked on the lower rail of a chair, his hat tipped low enough to shadow his eyes, but not low enough to hide the way they moved, tracking every shift, every whisper, every glance toward the street. He had been sheriff for 8 years, long enough to know that trouble did not always arrive loud. Sometimes it walked in silent and waited for the town to reveal itself. First, Clint Dower should have been at the bar by now, that much was certain. The man had habits as fixed as sunrise, and just as predictable: one drink before dusk, two more before dark, then a slow walk home that no one interrupted, not because they respected him, but because they understood the kind of weight he carried without ever needing to name it. Hale pushed off the chair and stepped outside. The air had cooled, but the heat of the day still clung to the wood and stone like it was reluctant to let go. Lanterns flickered along the main street casting long, uneven shadows that stretched and bent across the dirt. He scanned the road once, then again, slower this time. The hitching posts were half empty, the general store closed early, a rare thing in Dry Creek, and across the way near the water trough, she was still there. Ilara Nakoa had not moved far since afternoon. She now sat on the edge of the trough, hands resting lightly in her lap, the silver pendant still at her throat, catching the lantern light in. Softer pulses now, less sharp, but no less present. Hale watched her for a long moment before crossing the street. His boots made a steady rhythm against the ground, not hurried, not slow, just enough to let her know he was coming without needing to call out. She lifted her eyes before he spoke, not startled, not curious, just aware, like she had been expecting him. Evening. Hale said, his voice carrying the weight of habit more than authority. She nodded once. Sheriff, she replied, and there was something in the way she said it, not respectful, not dismissive, just certain. Hale studied her face, searching for something that would settle the unease building in his chest. You planning to stay in town tonight? He asked. She glanced toward the far end of the street where darkness had begun to gather between buildings. For a while, she said. Long enough. Hale followed her gaze, but saw nothing except shadow and stillness. Long enough for what? He pressed. She turned back to him then, and for the first time, there was something behind her eyes, not emotion, not fear, something closer to recognition, like she was seeing him as part of a pattern already in motion. For things to be seen, she said quietly. Hale felt his jaw tighten, not from anger, but from the kind of uncertainty that made a man want clearer answers. You know, folks are talking, he said. Clint Dower has not been seen since he walked past you this afternoon. She did not look surprised. She did not look concerned. She only nodded once, as if confirming something already understood. People go where they are meant to go, she said. Hale let out a slow breath, the kind a man takes when he is trying to stay steady on ground that feels less certain with every step. That is not how this town works, he said. She tilted her head slightly, the same small motion as before. Maybe that is why it has to change, she answered. The words settled between them, heavier than they should have been for something spoken so softly. From the saloon behind them came the sound of a glass set down too hard, followed by a chair scraping across. Would someone stepped out onto the porch, then stopped when they saw the two of them standing there together. More eyes followed from inside, drawn to the quiet tension rather than any raised voice. Hale noticed the shift without turning his head. He could feel it in the way the air tightened, the way men leaned closer without meaning to. You got somewhere to sleep? He asked finally. She shook her head once. I do not need one. Hale glanced toward the church at the end of the road, then back at her. Everyone needs somewhere to be when night comes, he said. She looked past him again, toward that same stretch of darkness where the street seemed to disappear into shadow. Night is when things come back, she said, and for the first time Hale felt something colder than uncertainty settle in his chest, something closer to warning. Before he could ask anything more, a horse whinnied sharply from the far end of town, breaking the moment. Both of them turned toward the sound. The animal stood tied near the livery, reins pulled tight against the post, no rider in sight. Hale's eyes narrowed. He knew that horse. He knew every horse in Dry Creek, and that one belonged to a man who should have been leading it, not leaving it behind. He looked back at Ilara, but she was already watching him, not the horse, not the street, him, as if waiting to see what he would do next. And in that silence Hale realized something he could not yet explain. Clint Dower was not the only thing in this town that had begun to go missing. Something else had shifted, something quieter, something deeper, and whatever it was, it had started the moment she stepped across the edge of Dry Creek. The horse kept pulling against the rope, like it could feel something no one else could see. Its breath came out in short bursts, even though the night air had turned cool enough to settle a man's nerves. Sheriff Hale stepped closer, slow and steady, hand resting near his belt, not reaching, not threatening, just ready. The lantern light from the livery cast a dull glow across the animal's flank, revealing sweat that had not yet dried, which meant it had been ridden hard not long ago, and then left without care, without reason. Hale reached out, placing a firm hand against the horse's neck, feeling the tremor beneath the skin. Easy now, he murmured, more for himself than the animal. The leather saddle creaked softly as the horse shifted its weight. The reins were tied tight, but not in the usual, not more like someone had looped them quick and left in a hurry. Hale's eyes moved over every detail. The stirrup turned slightly inward, the dust pattern uneven, like the rider had dismounted fast without checking their footing, and there on the saddle horn something caught the light, a small mark not blood, not damage, just a smudge of pale gray. Dust that did not belong to this. Part of Dry Creek. Hale rubbed it between his fingers. It felt finer than the dirt in town, almost like ash, but there had been no fire, not recently, not close enough to explain. It behind him, he could feel the town gathering, not close enough to interfere, but near enough to watch. Whispers drifted low and uncertain. A man cleared his throat. Someone else muttered Clint's name, like saying it out loud, might bring him back, or at least make sense of the silence. Hale straightened, slowly turning just enough to catch the edge of the street in his view. Alara was still there near the trough. She had not moved, but something about her had shifted, not in posture, not in expression, but in presence. Like the space around her had grown quieter than the rest of the town, as if even the night itself held a different kind of stillness. Where she stood, Hale walked back toward her, boots pressing into the dirt with more weight. Now each step carrying the realization that whatever was happening would not answer to simple questions. That horse belongs to Daniel Reeves, Hale said as he approached. He was at the saloon not an hour ago. Alara nodded once, like she already knew the name, already understood the meaning behind it. And now he is not, she said. Hale stopped a few feet from her, the lantern light catching the edge of her face, softening, nothing revealing, nothing. You see him leave? Hale asked. She shook her head slowly. I do not need to see a thing to know where it goes. Hale felt a flicker of frustration rise, not anger, just the strain of trying to hold on to something solid in a place that was beginning to feel less certain by the minute. People do not just vanish in my town, he said firmly. She looked at him, then not challenging, not dismissing, just meeting his certainty with something quieter, something deeper. They do when the ground beneath them is not as still as they believe. She answered. The words settled heavier than the night air. Hale opened his mouth to press further, but the sound of hurried footsteps cut through the street. A young man stumbled into view from the direction of the church, hat missing, shirt half untucked, breath coming fast like he had run farther than he should have needed to. Sheriff, he called, voice tight with something close to panic. You need to come see this. Hale turned immediately, instincts moving before thought. What is it? He asked, already stepping toward him. The young man swallowed hard, glancing once toward Alara before answering, like he was unsure if she should hear. Tracks, he said, out past the ridge heading north, but they stopped, just stopped, like the rider got off. And then nothing, no footprints, no trail, just empty ground. Hale's jaw tightened again, not in anger, but in recognition that whatever pattern had begun was now repeating itself. He looked back at Alara one more time, searching her face for anything that might anchor what he was hearing, but she only watched him the same way she had before, like she was waiting not for answers, but for him to understand the question. You coming? The young man asked. Hale hesitated for half a second, just long enough for the silence to stretch, then nodded once. Show me, he said, and as they moved down the street toward the edge of town, Hale could feel it again, that quiet shift in the air, like something unseen was walking just ahead of them, not leaving tracks, not making sound, but guiding them all the same. And behind them Alara remained by the trough, still and silent, her hand resting lightly against the silver pendant, as if feeling its weight not as metal, but as memory. And far beyond the last lantern, where the dark pressed close against the land, something waited, not hidden, not hunting, just ready. The tracks ended where the land flattened into a stretch of pale earth, just beyond the ridge, a place where the wind moved slower and the ground held its shape longer than anywhere else in Dry Creek. Sheriff Hale crouched low, one knee pressing into the dirt, fingers tracing the last clear imprint of a boot heel. It was deep enough to show weight, a man stepping down with purpose, not stumbling, not dragged, just stepping. And then nothing, no second print, no shift in the soil, no sign of where that step had gone. Next, the young man stood a few feet back, arms wrapped tight around himself, though the night had not turned cold enough to warrant it. I told you, he said, voice quieter now, like the place itself demanded it. It just stops. Hale did not answer right away. He leaned closer, brushing the surface with the edge of his palm, feeling for any break in the pattern, any disturbance too small for the eye, but the earth lay still as if untouched beyond that final mark. He stood slowly, scanning the ground in widening circles, boots careful not to disturb what little evidence remained. The lantern light flickered with each movement, casting shifting shadows that made the emptiness feel deeper than it was spread out. Hale said finally, his voice low but firm, do not step past the last print, keep your distance, and watch the ground. Two more men, who had followed at a Distance nodded and moved apart, their steps hesitant like they were afraid the earth might give way beneath them. Without warning, Hale walked the edge of the clearing, counting the space in his head. 10 feet, 20, 30, nothing changed. The same unbroken stretch of dust lay before him, as if the man they were tracking had simply ceased to exist mid-step. He turned back toward the young man. Reeves was sober when you saw him? Hale asked. The young man nodded quickly. Yes, sir. He had just finished his first drink, said he was heading out to check his horses before dark. Hale's eyes narrowed slightly. The timing fit too cleanly, too easy, like pieces placed where they were meant to be found. And you are sure no one else came through here? The young man swallowed, glancing over his shoulder toward the dark ridge behind them. No, sir, I would have seen them. There is no cover out here, nothing to hide behind. Hale let the silence settle for a moment longer, then straightened, fully brushing the dust from his hands. The motion felt heavier than it should have, like the ground had given him something without explanation and expected him to carry it back with him. All right, he said. We head back for now. No sense chasing a trail that does not exist. The men exchanged uneasy looks, but did not argue. They turned together, moving toward the faint glow of lanterns in the distance, the town of Dry Creek, waiting in that same quiet tension they had left behind. As they walked, Hale kept his eyes forward, but his mind circled back again and again to that single print, the weight of it, the finality of it, a step taken with certainty into something that left no trace and no sound. When they reached the edge of town, the air felt different again, heavier, closer, like the buildings themselves were holding something in the spaces between their walls. The saloon door stood open. Now more men gathered inside than before, though none of them spoke. Above a murmur, Sheriff Hale paused at the edge of the street, scanning the familiar lines of wood and dust as if seeing them for the first time, and there she was, still near the trough, exactly where he had left her. Alara Nakoa had not moved far, her posture unchanged, her presence as steady as before, but now there were more eyes on her than the rest of the town combined, some washed with suspicion, some with fear, and a few with something harder to name. Hale stepped toward her, the men behind him stopping short, as if unwilling to close the distance. You knew? Hale said, not accusing, not questioning, just stating what had begun to feel undeniable. She met his gaze without hesitation. I knew it had begun, she replied. Hale exhaled slowly, the weight in his chest settling into something colder, more deliberate. Reeves is gone, same as Clint Dower, and both times they were last seen near you. He said. The words carried the shape of an accusation, but not the certainty of one. She did not react. She did not defend. She simply listened. And you think that means I took them? She said. Hale shook his head once. I think it means something is happening, and you are the only one not surprised by it. She considered that for a moment, her eyes drifting past him toward the dark stretch beyond the town. Surprise belongs to those who believe nothing follows them, she said quietly. But everything does, Sheriff. Everything waits its turn. Hale felt the words settle deeper than he wanted them to. He shifted his stance, grounding himself in the familiar weight of the badge on his chest. Then tell me what is waiting, he said. She looked back at him, and for the first time, there was something else there, not emotion, not fear, something closer to patience, like she had been carrying a truth long enough to know it could not be rushed. Not what? She said softly. Who? The wind moved again, just enough to stir the dust at their feet, and in that moment the town of Dry Creek no longer felt like a place where things happened by chance. It felt like a place where something had come to be seen, and it was not finished yet. The night settled deeper over Dry Creek, but no one went to sleep. Not really. Lamps stayed lit longer than usual. Doors remained half open, as if people were unsure whether to hide or to watch. And in the middle of it all, the silence stretched tighter with every passing hour. Sheriff Hale stood outside the saloon, arms folded, eyes fixed on the far end of the street where darkness pressed against the edge of town like something waiting its turn. Behind him, voices drifted low and uncertain. Men who once spoke loud now chose their words carefully, as if sound itself might carry farther than it should. Two men do not just disappear, one voice muttered. Not without someone doing the taking, another answered quieter, or something. Hale did not turn. He did not need to. He knew the weight of those words without hearing them clearly. He had spent years keeping order in a place that believed it understood its own rules, but tonight those rules felt thinner, like old paper worn at the edges. The saloon door creaked behind him, and Deputy Aaron Pike stepped out, hat in hand, brow tight with concern. Sheriff, he said, folks are getting restless. They are starting to connect things. Hale nodded once, still watching the dark. They already have, he said. Pike hesitated, then added, they are saying it is her. Hale finally turned his head slightly enough to see the reflection of lantern light in Pike's eyes. And what do you say? Pike swallowed, shifting his weight. I say she was the last one seen near both of them, and I say that is enough for some men in there to decide what comes next. Hale let out a slow breath, then pushed off the post, turning fully toward the street. Alara still sat by the trough, as if the hours had not touched her, as if time itself moved differently. Where she was, a few townsfolk stood farther back, watching her like one might watch a storm on the horizon, unsure whether it would pass or break over them. Hale stepped forward, Pike following a pace behind. You need to come with me, Hale said when he reached her, his voice steady, not forceful. She looked up at him, calm as before. Where? She asked. Somewhere quieter, Hale answered, away from men who are looking for reasons instead of answers. She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once and rose to her feet, the movement slow, deliberate, like everything else about her. Hale turned, leading the way toward the small office beside the jail. Pike fell and stepped behind them, glancing over his shoulder as murmurs began to rise louder now that the girl was moving through town, not hiding, not resisting, just walking, and that unsettled them more than anything. Inside the office, the air felt cooler, the thick wooden walls holding back the noise from outside. Hale closed the door behind them, and for a moment the silence inside was heavier than the noise outside. He removed his hat, setting it on the desk, then turned to face her fully. You said something has begun, Hale said. You said people are being seen for what they are. Alara stood near the center of the room, her eyes moving briefly over the space, the desk, the chair, the small barred window, before settling back on him. Yes, she said. Then you know why those men are gone. Hale pressed. She did not answer right away. Instead, she reached up, lightly touching the silver pendant at her throat, as if feeling its weight, before speaking. They are not gone, she said quietly. Not in the way you think. Pike shifted uneasily behind Hale. Then where are they? He asked, unable to hold back the question. Alara glanced toward him briefly, then back to Hale. Where they should have gone long ago, she replied. Hale's jaw tightened again. The answer did not satisfy, but it did not feel like a lie either. That is not something I can write in a report, he said. She tilted her head slightly. Maybe that is because it was never meant to be written. She said. The words settled between them, carrying a truth that felt older than the room itself. Outside, a sudden shout broke through the walls, followed by the sound of boots moving fast, more than a few this time. Pike stepped toward the door instinctively. That is not good, he muttered. Hale did not move right away. His eyes remained on Alara. If I step outside right now, there are men who think they are protecting this town, he said. They are wrong, but they believe it, and belief can be louder than truth. Alara nodded once. Yes, she said softly. It always is. Hale studied her for a long moment, then asked the question that had been building since the first disappearance. Are more going to vanish? She met his gaze without hesitation. Only the ones who are called, she answered. The words did not rise, they did not fall. They simply existed, like a fact waiting to be understood. The pounding on the door came next, sharp and urgent. Pike moved to open it, but paused, looking back at Hale for instruction. Hale gave a slight nod. Pike pulled the door open just enough to reveal 3 men outside, faces tight with anger and fear. Sheriff, one of them said. Another one is missing. Hale closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again, the weight in his chest settling into something colder, something certain. Now the pattern was no longer a question, it was happening, and the town was already choosing what to believe. Hale turned back toward Alara one last time. You need to stay here, he said. She did not argue, she did not move, she only watched him with that same quiet awareness, as if she already knew where this night was leading. And outside the voices grew louder, not with understanding, but with something far more dangerous, the need to act before thinking, the kind of need that had shaped this town long before she ever walked into it. The noise outside had changed. It was no longer scattered voices or uncertain whispers. It had become something heavier, something shared. Boots gathered in clusters, steps moving in the same direction, not by order, but by instinct. Sheriff Hale stepped out onto the porch and saw it at once. Men standing in small groups along the street, not speaking much, just watching the jail door, watching him, watching each other, as if waiting for someone else to make the first move. Deputy Pike stood close behind him, his voice low. That is not just worry anymore, he said. Hale did not answer right away. His eyes moved across familiar faces, men he had known for years, men who had borrowed tools, shared meals, laughed too loud at nothing, and now stood with jaws set and shoulders tight, like something inside them had shifted into place. Who was missing? Hale asked finally. One of the men stepped forward, removing his hat, as if that alone could steady what he was about to say. Samuel Carter, he said. Last seen heading home past the church maybe 30 minutes ago. Hale nodded once. Carter was not like Clint, not like the others. He was quieter, kept to himself, worked the grain store, and left before dark. Most days the pattern did not fit clean anymore, and that unsettled Hale more than anything. Anyone see him after he left the road? Hale asked. The man shook his head. No sir, just gone same as the others. A murmur passed through the crowd, not loud, but tight like a rope, pulled just enough to hold tension. Without snapping, Hale felt it building, not panic, not yet, but something closer to decision the kind men make when they decide they have waited long enough. You keeping her inside? Another voice called out from the side, sharper than the rest. Hale turned slightly enough to see who spoke, a ranch hand named Cole Barrett, young, strong, too quick to act, and not yet old enough to understand the weight of it. She is under my watch, Hale replied, steady, and even Barrett took a step forward, boots pressing hard into the dirt. Under your watch, or under protection? He asked. The words hung in the air, sharper than they should have been. Pike shifted beside Hale, his hand hovering near his belt, not reaching, just ready. Hale held his ground. His voice did not rise. Under my responsibility, he said. Barrett let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, but held no humor. Then your responsibility is costing us men, he said, and there it was, not anger, not fear, something worse, something that sounded like reason, twisted just enough to feel right to those who wanted it to. Hale stepped down from the porch, closing the distance by a few feet, not enough to threaten, just enough to remind them he was still standing between thought and action. Listen to me, Hale said, his voice carrying now, not loud, but firm enough to reach every ear on that street. No one here has seen her take anyone. No one is proof of anything except that people are missing. And that is not enough to decide what comes next. Barrett met his gaze, unblinking. It is enough for me, he said quietly, and a few others shifted behind him, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just agreeing. Without saying it, Hale felt that shift like a change in weather, something moving through the town that would not stop on its own. And what happens when you are wrong? Hale asked. Barrett hesitated for half a second, just long enough to reveal it. He had not thought that far, not really, but the moment passed, and his jaw tightened again. Then at least we did something, he said, and the words landed heavier than any threat because they carried no doubt. Hale looked at the men around him one by one, seeing the same thing in different forms. Uncertainty dressed as certainty, fear dressed as purpose, the kind of thinking that had built towns like this and broken them just as easily. Behind him, the door to the office creaked open. Alara stepped out onto the porch, without hurry, without hesitation. The movement alone was enough to pull every eye toward her. The street fell quiet, not because they respected her, but because they did not understand her, and that was louder than anything else. She stood there for a moment, looking out over the gathered men, her expression unchanged, her presence steady. As before, Hale turned slightly toward her, lowering his voice just enough for only her to hear. You should not have come out, he said. She did not look at him. They were already coming, she replied softly. It does not change anything. Hale knew she was right, and that was what troubled him most. She stepped down from the porch, stopping a few feet in front of the crowd, not close enough to provoke, not far enough to retreat. You believe I brought this, she said, her voice calm, carrying across the silence. Without effort, no one answered at first, but the absence of denial spoke louder than words. She nodded once, as if confirming something expected. Then you should ask yourselves why it began now, she continued. A man near the back shifted uneasily. Because you walked in, he muttered. Alara's gaze moved over them, not judging, not accusing, just seeing. No, she said quietly, because something that was hidden has been waiting to be seen. The wind moved again, light, but enough to stir the dust around their boots. Hale watched the crowd, not her. He saw it, then the moment when doubt tried to rise and was pushed back down by something heavier, the need to act, to choose, to decide before understanding could catch up. And he realized the danger was no longer what was happening in the dark beyond town. It was here, in the space between these men and the girl standing before them, and somewhere in that silence he understood something else. Just as clearly, whatever was taking those men, it was not done yet, and neither was this town. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted first like a breath drawn too deep and held too long. Then someone moved a single step forward, boots grinding against dirt, louder than they should have been in a town this still. Cole Barrett did not look at the others when he moved. He kept his eyes on Alara, like he had already made his choice long before this moment. You talk like you know something we do. Not. He said, his voice steady but tight at the edges. Maybe you do, maybe that is the problem. A few men behind him shifted closer, not rushing, not charging, just closing distance the way a storm closes in. Without asking permission, Sheriff Hale stepped forward at the same time, placing himself between them, not raising a hand, not drawing a weapon, just standing there like a line no one had crossed yet. That is far enough. Hale said, his voice low but firm. Barrett stopped, not because he wanted to, but because something in Hale's tone still held weight, still carried years of being the man who decided where things ended. You cannot hold that line forever, Barrett replied quietly. Hale did not look back at him. I do not need forever, he said. I just need long enough for you to think. The words hung there, and for a moment it almost worked. A flicker of hesitation moved through the crowd like wind through tall grass, not strong enough to stop them, but enough to bend something inside a few men. Alara watched it all, without moving, her hands at her sides, her posture calm, like she was standing in a place untouched by the tension around her. You are afraid, she said softly. The words were not loud, but they carried farther than any shout. Heads turned toward her again, not because of the volume, but because of the truth in it. Barrett's jaw tightened. We are careful, he corrected. She shook her head once. No, she said. Careful waits, fear rushes. A murmur followed that, not agreement, not denial, just the sound of men hearing something they did not want to admit. Hale glanced back at her briefly, then returned his focus to the crowd. He could feel it again, that shift, the moment where things could still turn one way or the other, but not stay where they were. Everyone take a step back, Hale said. Go home, lock your doors if you want, but do not make this worse than it already is. One man near the edge let out a short breath. It is already worse, he said. 3 men gone, and you are asking us to wait. Hale nodded slowly. Yes, he said, because waiting is the only thing standing between us and doing something we cannot take back. The words landed heavier than the others, not because they were louder, but because they carried something real, something every man there understood, whether they admitted it or not. Barrett looked around, then back at Hale, then past him to Alara, and for the first time something in his expression cracked, not fear, not doubt, something closer to confusion, like the ground beneath his certainty had shifted just enough to make him question where he stood. Then tell us what to do, he said. The question came out quieter than before, not a challenge, not quite a plea, but something in between. Hale opened his mouth to answer, but stopped because the truth was he did not know, not yet, and saying anything else would only push them closer to the edge. He was trying to hold Alara step forward, then just one step, not enough to threaten, not enough to retreat, but enough to draw every eye again. You do nothing, she said simply. Barrett frowned. Nothing is what got us here, he said. She met his gaze without flinching. No, she replied. Doing nothing now is what keeps you from becoming what you fear. The wind moved again, lifting dust between them, soft and slow, like the land itself was breathing. Hale watched the crowd as those words settled. He saw it again, that hesitation, that thin, fragile space where choice still existed, but it was narrowing with every second. And then from the far end of town a sound broke through, not loud, not sharp, just the distant creak of wood shifting somewhere near the edge of the road, where the buildings gave way to open land. Every head turned at once, eyes straining into the dark where the lantern light did not reach. Hale felt it before he saw anything, that same quiet presence that had followed every disappearance. Not a sound, not a shape, just the sense that something had arrived at the edge of what they could see and was waiting to be noticed. One of the men whispered under his breath, "You hear that?" No one answered because they all had. Hale took a step forward, instinct pulling him toward the sound before thought could catch up, but Alara's voice stopped him, not loud, not urgent, just certain. "It is time," she said. Hale turned back to her, his eyes searching hers for anything that resembled explanation, but found only that same steady calm, like she had known this moment was coming since before she stepped into Dry Creek. And in that instant Hale understood something he had been resisting since the beginning. This was never about finding the men who were gone. It was about facing something the town had left behind long before she arrived, and now it had come back to be seen whether they were ready or not. The sound came again, not louder, not closer, but clearer now, like wood settling under weight that had not been there before. Sheriff Hale stepped past the edge of the lantern light, boots slowing as the ground shifted from packed dirt to the softer earth beyond town. Behind him, the men followed, not tightly, not together, but drawn forward by something they could not name. and could not ignore Cole Barrett was among them. His earlier certainty dulled now into something quieter, something that watched instead of pushed. Alara moved last her. Steps measured her presence unchanged, as if she was not following the moment, but walking into something she already understood. The road thinned as it reached the open stretch where Dry Creek ended and the land took over. No fences, no markers. Just a wide breadth of earth and sky. The ridge rose ahead, a dark line against the night, and there at its base shapes began to form, not sudden, not sharp, but slow, like they had always been there, and were only now being noticed. Hale stopped first, not from fear, but from recognition, the kind that comes when a man realizes he has been walking towards something long before he saw it. Figures stood in the low light, not moving, not hiding, just present, a line of them, spaced with intention, not random, not scattered, their silhouettes calm and still, like the land itself had chosen to stand upright. Alara stepped forward, then passing Hale by a single pace, not looking back. The silver pendant at her throat caught what little light remained, a soft glint that seemed to answer something in the dark. The figures did not raise weapons, they did not speak, they simply waited, and the space between them held more weight than any shout. Hale felt the men behind him slow, some stopping altogether, others taking cautious steps as if unsure where the ground was safe to stand. One of them whispered, "Who are they?" No one answered, because the answer was already in the air. Older than the town, older than the road that led to it. Alara stopped a few feet ahead of Hale, her voice low but clear. "They are not here for you," she said without turning. "They are here for what was left behind." Hale's eyes moved along the line of figures. He saw faces now, not clearly, not fully, but enough to know they were not strangers to this land, even if they were strangers to the town beside him. Barrett shifted his weight, the sound of his boot pressing into dirt louder than it should have been. "Where are the men?" he asked. The question came out thinner than before, less demand, more need. Alara did not answer him right away. Instead, she raised her hand slowly, palm open, not toward the town, not toward the men, but toward the ridge, and in that motion something changed, not in the figures, not in the land, but in the understanding of it. From the darkness, just beyond the line, three shapes emerged, not dragged, not forced, but walking their steps, uneven, not from injury, but from the weight of being seen. Clint Dower came first, his shoulders lower than they had been that afternoon, his eyes not fixed on anyone in front of him, but somewhere deeper, somewhere behind his own thoughts. Daniel Reeves followed, then Samuel Carter, each of them moving the same way, not rushed, not bound, just return. The town behind Hale went quiet in a way that felt different from before. This was not fear, this was recognition, the kind that settles heavy, because it does not leave room for easy answers. Hale did not move, he did not reach for them, he only watched as they came to a stop a few yards from the line of figures. Clint lifted his head slightly, his gaze passing over Hale, over the men behind him, then stopping for a brief moment on Alara. There was no anger there, no accusation, only something quieter, something that looked like a man seeing something he had avoided for too long. And no longer could Reeves look down at his hands, turning them once, like he was remembering what they had done. Carter stood still, his breath slow, his posture no longer guarded, just open. Alara lowered her hand, the motion small, but final. "They were not taken," she said softly. "They were brought back." Hale felt the words settle deeper than anything spoken that night, not because they explained everything, but because they removed the part that had been wrong from the beginning. No one had vanished, nothing had been stolen, something had been returned. The figures along the ridge did not step forward, they did not claim anything, they simply stood, as if their presence alone was enough, as if the truth did not need to be spoken louder than it already was. Hale turned his head slightly, looking at the men behind him, seeing their faces in the low light, some confused, some ashamed, some still searching for something else to hold on to, but the ground beneath them had changed, and they knew it. Barrett did not speak this time, he only watched Clint standing there in front of him, the certainty he had carried earlier gone, not replaced, just gone. And in that silence Hale understood the line he had been holding all night had not been between the girl and the town, it had been between the town and something it had refused to face until now, and the moment had finally arrived, without force, without sound, without a single shot fired, just truth standing where no one could ignore it anymore. Morning came slow over Dry Creek, not with the usual warmth that pulled men from their beds and set the town moving, but with a quiet that lingered like something unfinished. Sheriff Hale stood near the edge of town, where the ridge met the open land, the same place where the night had drawn its line and held it. He had not slept, not really, none. Of them had the three men who had returned stood apart, now not under guard, not confined, just separate. Clint Dower leaned against a post near the livery, his posture no longer carrying the weight it once did. His eyes followed nothing in particular, like he was seeing something that was no longer there. Daniel Reeves sat on the edge of the trough, hands resting on his knees, staring at the ground, as if the dust itself held answers he had not yet found. Samuel Carter remained near the church steps. Shoulders lowered, his breath steady but different, like a man who had set something down and did not know what to do with the empty space it left behind. The town moved around them slowly, cautiously. Voices stayed low, not from fear now, but from something closer to understanding, the kind that does not arrive all at once, but settles piece by piece. Sheriff Hale adjusted his hat and looked out toward the ridge. The figures from the night were gone, not vanished, not hidden, simply no longer standing where they had been, as if their presence had never needed to last longer than the moment it was seen. Alara stood a few yards ahead of him, facing the same direction, her silhouette still against the pale morning light, the silver pendant at her throat no longer catching fire from lanterns, but resting quiet against her chest. Hale stepped closer, boots pressing into the ground, that felt different, now not softer, not harder, just known. They are gone, Hale said. She nodded once. They were never meant to stay, she replied. Hale looked past her to the open land stretching beyond the ridge, miles of quiet earth that held more stories than any town could carry. And the men, he said, what happens to them now? Alara did not answer right away. Her eyes remained on the horizon where the light met the land. That depends, she said softly, on whether they remember what they were shown or choose to forget it again. Hale followed her gaze, then glanced back toward the town. Clint had not moved. Reeves still stared down. Carter had closed his eyes for a moment, like he was listening to something only he could hear. People forget, Hale said. It is easier that way. Alara turned her head slightly toward him, not fully, just enough for her voice to reach him. Yes, she said, but not all forgetting is the same. Some of it is peace, and some of it is hiding. The words settled into the morning air with a weight that did not need to be explained. Hale let out a slow breath, then asked the question that had been waiting since the night began. Why come here? He said. Why now? Alara finally turned to face him fully, her expression unchanged, but something in her eyes carried a quieter truth, now something closer to completion. Because this is where it happened, she said simply. Hale felt the answer before he understood it fully. What happened? He asked, though part of him already knew. She looked back toward the ridge, then down at the ground beneath their feet. Something that was buried without being faced, she said, something that did not leave just because people stopped speaking of it. Hale nodded slowly, the pieces aligning, not in detail, not in names, but in shape, in weight, in the sense of something old being brought into the light without force, without noise. And you, he said, what are you now? She held his gaze for a moment longer, then shook her head once. Nothing more than someone who remembered. She answered. The simplicity of it carried more than any explanation could. Hale looked at her, then at the town, then back at the open land, and for the first time since she had arrived, he did not feel the need to ask another question. Some things had already been answered, not with words, but with what had been seen, what had been returned. Alara reached up slowly, removing the silver pendant from her neck. The chain slipped free, without sound. She held it for a moment in her hand, then stepped forward, placing it gently on the wooden rail beside Hale. The metal caught the morning light, once soft and brief, then settled into stillness. Hale looked down at it, then back at her. What is it? He asked. She did not look at the pendant, a reminder, she said, not of what was done, but of what was finally seen. She turned then, without hurry, without hesitation, and began to walk away from the town, her steps steady, her figure growing smaller against the wide stretch of land. No one called after her, no one tried to stop her, because there was nothing left to ask that she had not already answered. Hale stood there for a long moment, watching until she passed beyond the ridge, and the light took her from sight. He reached down, picking up the pendant, holding it in his hand. The metal felt warmer than it should have been, as if it carried something beyond its weight. Behind him, the town of Dry Creek began to move again, slowly, carefully, not the same as before, but not entirely different either, just aware. Hale closed his hand around the pendant, then opened it again, looking at the small piece of silver resting in his palm, and for the first time, he understood something that did not need to be spoken out here. Justice did not arrive with noise, it did not ask for permission, and it did not stay longer than it had to. It simply came when it was time, and left behind what a man chose to do with it.